one man walked out of a burning Jerusalem alive. 1,000,000 others didn't. Hero, traitor, survivor. 2,000 years later, we're still arguing about which one he was. Before we step into the chaos, listen to the only voice that came back out of it. Then you can weigh the evidence for yourself. Titus retired into the tower of Antonia and resolved to storm the temple the next day, early in the morning, with his whole army, and to encamp round about the holy house. But as for that house, God had, for certain, long ago doomed it to the fire. And now that fateful day was come, according to the revolution of ages. It was the 10th day of the month Lois, upon which it was formerly burnt by the king of Babylon. Although these flames took their rise from the Jews themselves, and were occasioned by them, for upon Titus's retiring, the seditious lay still for a little while, and then attacked the Romans again, when those that guarded the holy house fought with those that quenched the fire that was burning the inner court of the temple. The Romans put the Jews to flight and proceeded as far as that holy house itself, at which time one of the soldiers, without staying for any orders, and without any concern or dread upon him at so great an undertaking, being hurried on by a certain divine fury, snatched somewhat out of the materials that were on fire, and being lifted up by another soldier, he set fire to a golden window, through which there was a passage to the rooms that were round about the holy house, on the north side of it. As the flames went upward, the Jews made a great clamor, such as so mighty an affliction required, and ran together to prevent it. And now they spared not their lives any longer, nor suffered anything to restrain their force, since that holy house was perishing, for whose sake it was that they kept such a guard about it. And now a certain person came running to Titus, and told him of this fire, as he was resting himself in his tent after the last battle. Whereupon he rose up in great haste, and, as he was, ran to the holy house, in order to have a stop put to the fire. After him followed all his commanders, and after them followed the several legions, in great astonishment. So there was a great clamor and tumult raised, as was natural upon the disorderly motion of so great an army. Then did Caesar, both by calling to the soldiers that were fighting with a loud voice, and giving a signal to them with his right hand, order them to quench the fire. But they did not hear what he said, though he spake so loud, having their ears already dimmed by a greater noise another way. Nor did they attend to the signal he made with his hand neither, as still some of them were distracted with fighting, and others with passion. But as for the legions that came running thither, neither any persuasions nor any threatenings could restrain their violence. Each one's own passion was his commander at this time. And as they were crowding into the temple together, many of them were trampled on by one another, while a great number fell among the ruins of the cloisters, which were still hot and smoking, and were destroyed in the same miserable way with those whom they had conquered. And when they were come near the holy house, they made as if they did not so much as hear Caesar's orders to the contrary, but they encouraged those that were before them to set it on fire. As for the seditious, they were into great distress already to afford their assistance towards quenching the fire. They were everywhere slain and everywhere beaten. And as for a great part of the people, they were weak and without arms, and had their throats cut wherever they were caught. Now round about the altar lay dead bodies, heaped one upon another. At the steps going up to it ran a great quantity of their blood, whither also the dead bodies that were slain above the altar fell down. And now, since Caesar was no way able to restrain the enthusiastic fury of the soldiers, and the fire proceeded on more and more, he went into the holy place of the temple with his commanders, and saw it with what was in it, which he found to be far superior to what the relations of foreigners contained, and not inferior to what ourselves boasted of and believed about. But as the flame had not as yet reached to its inward parts, but was consuming the rooms that were about the holy house, and Titus supposing what the fact was, that the house itself might yet be saved, he came in haste and endeavored to persuade the soldiers to quench the fire. He gave order to Liberelius the centurion, and one of those spearmen that were about him, to beat the soldiers that were refractory with their staves, and to restrain them. Yet were their passions too hard for the regards they had for Caesar, and the dread they had of him who forbade them, as was their hatred of the Jews, and a certain vehement inclination to fight them, too hard for them also. Moreover, the hope of the plunder induced many to go on, as having this opinion that all the places within were full of money, and seeing that all round about it was made of gold. And besides, one of those that went into the place prevented Caesar, when he ran so hastily out to restrain the soldiers, and threw the fire upon the hinges of the gate in the dark, whereby the flames burst out from within the holy house itself immediately. When the commanders retired, and Caesar with them, and when nobody any longer forbade those that were without to set fire to it, and thus was the holy house burnt down without Caesar's approbation. That was Josephus, the man who watched the end of his world and lived to write it down. This is episode 1 of The Fall of Jerusalem, Josephus and the End of the World. I'm Nat. Welcome inside the walls. Before I introduce you to the man, let me give you the prophecy the man's book fulfills, because there is a reason we're spending 10 weeks with Josephus, and it's not just because he wrote well or because his story is dramatic. It is because he is the eyewitness to a prophecy Christ made 37 years before it happened in Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke chapter 21. When our Lord walked out of the Jerusalem temple with his disciples, the temple had just been rebuilt by Herod the Great, a project that had taken 46 years and was, by every ancient account, the most magnificent religious building in the East Mediterranean. The disciples wanted Christ to admire it. Matthew's account, chapter 4, verses 1 to 3. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily, I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall we see these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? Luke gives us the same conversation from a slightly different angle, chapter 21, verses 5 to 7. And as some spake of the temple, how it was adorned with goodly stones and gifts, he said, As for these things which ye behold, the days will come in which there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And they asked him, saying, Master, but when shall these things be? And what sign will there be when these things shall come to pass? Jesus was speaking by any reasonable dating in about the year 33 AD. He was telling the disciples plainly that the building they were standing next to would be destroyed, not one stone left upon another. 30 years later, in August 70 AD, that prophecy was fulfilled in the most literal way possible. The temple was destroyed, the stones were pulled down, and, in many cases, dispersed across the Roman world. And the man who watched it happen, the only eyewitness of that fulfillment, whose account survives, was Josephus. That is why we're spending 10 weeks with him. Christ said it would fall. Josephus tells us exactly how, and a great deal of what comes next for the Jewish people, for the early Christian church, for how the ancient world understood the God of Israel, flows from what Josephus witnessed and wrote down. Now, the man himself. So who was he? And how does a Jewish priest from Jerusalem end up sitting inside the Roman camp, taking notes while his city burns? To answer that, we have to go back to a baby born in the most dangerous family tree in the empire. Flavius Josephus was born in Jerusalem in either 37 or 38 AD in the Roman province of Judea. His parents welcomed their bundle of joy into a world already tangled in drama. Before we go back to his family tree, a note on the world he was born into, because 37 AD was a year the Roman Empire was, briefly, holding its breath. Tiberius Caesar, the emperor who had held Rome together for 23 years after Augustus, had died in March of 37 AD in his villa on the island of Capri. He was succeeded by his great-nephew, Gaius Julius Caesar, whom history remembers by his childhood nickname, Caligula, which means little boots, given to him by his father's soldiers when he was about 3 years old. Caligula would go mad within 4 years and be assassinated. He would, in 40 AD, order a statue of himself to be placed inside the Temple of Jerusalem, a demand that nearly triggered a Jewish revolt 3 decades before the actual revolt began. The demand was withdrawn only when Caligula was killed before the statue could be installed. After Caligula came Claudius. After Claudius came Nero, whom we'll meet later in this episode when Josephus travels to Rome. After Nero came the year of the 4 emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian, which we'll walk through in episode 4. That is the Roman political weather Josephus was born into and grew up under. 5 emperors in his first 32 years of life. Palace intrigue, assassinations, the steady grinding of imperial administration, the tax collectors, the legions, and through all of it, the sense for Romans and for provincial subjects alike that Rome was permanent, that whatever came next, Rome would still be there. Josephus would live to see the Emperor Vespasian personally destroy his city, and he would live to see the Colosseum in Rome built with the treasure looted from the temple in Jerusalem. But that is later. First, the family he was born into. The Hasmoneans, Josephus's ancestors, were local royalty. They had come to power after the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucid Empire, a rebellion sparked by a king named Antiochus IV. Antiochus was notorious for forcing Greek customs onto the Jews and desecrating the Jewish temple. If that phrase, desecrating the temple, sounds familiar, it's because Jesus himself quotes Daniel's prophecy about it in Matthew 24, the abomination of desolation. For many of my Christian listeners, Antiochus was the textbook example. We'll come back to that prophecy. It matters more today than most people realize, specifically in episode 6, when the temple actually burns in the August of 70 AD. We will walk through Daniel 9 prophecy there in the historical moment it was pointing at. Hold that question until we get there. After Antiochus's abomination, a priestly family led a guerrilla war against the Seleucid army and the Hellenized Jews who supported the reforms. Their leader was Judah Maccabee, known as the Hammer for his ferocity in battle. After this brute and his Hismal militia recaptured Jerusalem and rededicated the temple in 164 BC, the revolt evolved into a fight for full political independence, eventually producing the Hasmonean kingdom, which lasted until about 63 BC. Jews still celebrate that victory today with the 8-day festival of Hanukkah. Now, if we're going to set Josephus in his world properly, and in episode 2, we are going to lean on what the Maccabees did, let me give you the actual story, not the footnote. The year is 167 BC. Antiochus IV, who styled himself Epiphanes, the visible God, decides the easiest way to govern his Jewish subjects is to abolish their religion outright. He stopped the daily sacrifice, he banned the Sabbath, he banned circumcision on pain of death, and then he built an altar to Zeus in the courtyard of the Jewish temple. And on the 25th of Kislev, 167 BC, he sacrificed a pig on that altar. This is the original abomination of desolation. The phrase Daniel wrote about, it has a specific historical reference. And it is this moment, 167 BC, Antiochus and a pig on the altar of the Lord. Jesus would later use Daniel's phrase on the Mount of Olives, but he was speaking after Daniel, and he was pointing forward. This 167 BC is where the phrase begins, not where it ends. The country erupts. A rural priest named Matthias kills both a Greek officer and a Jewish collaborator who stepped forward to make a pagan sacrifice in his village. He flees to the hills with his 5 sons. 3 years later, on the 25th of Kislev, 164 BC, 3 years to the day from that desecration, those sons retake the temple, cleanse the altar, and rekindle the menorah. That is what Hanukkah remembers. The son who led them is the one nicknamed the Hammer, Judah Maccabee. His brothers, Eleazar, Simon, Jonathan, John, would all, in turn, die in the wars that followed, and the dynasty their family founded, the Hasmoneans, ruled Judea for the next 100 years. That dynasty is Josephus's family. He grew up on the story, and so did every Jewish child in his world. When the Romans walked through Galilee in 66 AD and the rebels rose to meet them, what those rebels remembered was a small group of Jews against a vast empire, refusing to bow, refusing to be assimilated, and winning. That was the world Josephus, our little bundle of historical joy, was born into. He was the second child, trailing behind big brother Matthias. Young Joseph was a straight-A student of his day. He soaked up Jewish law and impressed religious leaders before most kids his age would have figured out how to sneak out after curfew. Although I do wonder whether sneaking out was a thing 2,000 years ago. In his autobiography, The Life of Josephus, he tells us that he was so sharp that high priests were already coming to him for legal opinions at the age of 14. Around 16, Josephus did something most teenagers don't. He decided to test drive his religion. He explored the three main Jewish sects, and he didn't just attend their lectures or read their books. He immersed himself in their daily practices, ascetic disciplines, and rules of life. He gave each one years of his attention. In his own words, quote, "When I was about 16 years old, I decided to explore the various sects among us. These are the three: the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. I believed that by experiencing each, I could choose the best. Accordingly, I endured fasting, hardship, and dedicated myself fully to understanding them all." Unquote. He started with the Pharisees, probably the most influential sect of the Second Temple period, both religiously and politically. The Pharisees believed the five books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and that they were divinely inspired and authoritative. But they also believed God had given Moses an oral law alongside the written one on Mount Sinai, and they treated that oral tradition with equal weight, even using it to modify older rulings. They taught divine providence, that God controls history and knows the fate of every human soul. They believed in a physical resurrection of the dead and that souls would face divine reward or punishment based on the deeds done in the body. And they believed in a populated spiritual realm, angels and demons, both at work in the world. Now, for my Christian listeners, pause here. This is the soil the New Testament grew in. The Pharisees are the group Jesus debates more than any other in the Gospels. He calls some of them whitewashed sepulchres. He has dinner in their homes. He shares some of their core convictions: bodily resurrection, the spirit world, the authority of the Hebrew scriptures. Where he breaks with them is on the oral law and on what God's heart actually requires. The Apostle Paul, before his Damascus Road encounter, was, in his own words, a Pharisee of Pharisees, trained at the feet of Gamaliel. So when you hear the Pharisees described, remember, this is the world that produced both the New Testament's most relentless opponents and several of its most important figures. The Sadducees were also priestly elites, but in almost every other way, they were the Pharisees' opposite. They rejected the afterlife, they rejected the resurrection, they rejected the spiritual realm entirely, and they completely dismissed the authority of the oral law. These are the same Sadducees who tried to trap Jesus on the question of resurrection in Matthew 22. The long story about the woman who outlived 7 brothers. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the 7? It's a sneer wrapped in a riddle. And Jesus' reply, "You do err, not knowing the scriptures, nor the power of God." Matthew 22:29. That lands a lot harder once you know who he was talking to. What the Sadducees did accept with iron literalism was the Mosaic penal code. The result was a brand of justice so harsh it shocked even the other Jews. They held tight to lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and they meant it. To understand what that actually looked like, we don't have to imagine. Josephus tells us a story. And for my Christian listeners, this one's going to land in a place you didn't expect. Before we walk through the story I'm about to tell you, I need to stop and be very careful with one name, because there are two Jameses in the New Testament story, and I do not want to conflate them. There's James, the son of Zebedee, the brother of the disciple the Lord loved, John, and one of the original 12. He is not the man we are about to walk through. He was killed 18 years earlier in about 44 AD by Herod Agrippa I, and we'll come to him in a moment. The James we are about to walk through, the man the Sadducees killed in 62 AD, is a different James. He is the brother of the Lord Jesus Christ. He is the man the Apostle Paul in Galatians chapter 1, verse 19 calls plainly James, the Lord's brother. He is the author of the Epistle of James in your New Testament. He is, at the time of his death, the leader of the Jerusalem church. And his story, his sad, terrible story, is one most modern Christians have never been told properly. So let me tell it. James, the brother of the Lord, was born in Nazareth, a younger brother of Jesus, in the household of Joseph and Mary. Matthew chapter 13, verse 55, gives us his name in a list. When the townspeople of Nazareth are amazed at Jesus' teaching, they ask, "Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And his brethren, James and Joseph and Simon and Judas, four brothers of the Lord?" And the next verse tells us at least two sisters in a village carpenter's household. During Jesus' earthly ministry, James did not believe him. John chapter 7 verse 5 says it in one plain line, "For neither did his brethren believe in him." Mark chapter 3 tells us Jesus' family thought he was, in the phrase Mark uses, beside himself. They wanted to take him home from the crowds. They wanted him to stop. The men who knew Jesus best, humanly speaking, his younger brothers, could not see who he was. Then came the crucifixion, then came the resurrection. The Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 gives us a list of people that the risen Christ appeared to. And in verse 7, there's one line. After that, he was seen of James. The risen Lord specifically appeared to his own brother. What was said in that meeting, we do not know. What we know is what James did next. He never left the church again. By the mid-40s AD, he was already a pillar of the Jerusalem church. When Paul writes to the Galatians about his first post-conversion visit to Jerusalem, he says in Galatians chapter 1, verse 19, "But other of the apostles saw I none, save James, the Lord's brother." Paul had come to see Peter. The only other man he was permitted to see was James, the brother of Jesus. That is how central James had become in a space of about 15 years. By 49 AD, James was presiding at the Council of Jerusalem, the single most important theological meeting in the history of the early church, the meeting that decided that Gentile believers did not have to keep the Mosaic law to be saved. And it was James who summed up that decision. Acts chapter 15, verse 19. "Wherefore my sentence is that we trouble not them which from among the Gentiles are turned to God." Somewhere in the 50s or early 60s AD, he wrote the epistle that bears his name. If you've ever read James 1 in your Bible, "Blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life." You have heard the voice of the man Ananias was about to kill. The Jerusalem church called him James the Just, not for his position, for his righteousness. According to the 2nd century church historian Josephus, preserved for us by Eusebius in his church history, book 2, chapter 23, James prayed so constantly on his knees in the temple courts that the calluses on his knees were said to be as hard as a camel's. He was a Nazarite from birth. He drank no wine, he ate no meat, he wore linen. He was, by every ancient account we have of him, one of the most respected men in Jerusalem, Jewish or Christian. That is the man Ananias arrested in 62 AD. The year is 62 AD. The Roman procurator of Judea, Festus, had just died at his post. His replacement, Albinus, is still on the road from Rome. Jerusalem has a brief window, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, with no Roman governor on the ground to keep order. The high priest at this moment is a Sadducee. His name is Ananias, son of Ananias. Josephus describes him in 2 words that hang in the air: bold and insolent, a man who saw the gap and moved. Ananias convened the Sanhedrin while no one was watching. He brought up several charges, and he condemned a small group of men to be stoned to death. One of those men was named James, James, the brother of Jesus. Josephus writes the line, and it's one of the most quoted lines in all ancient history outside the New Testament. Quote, he convened the judges of the Sanhedrin and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned. Unquote. Josephus gives us political fact. Josephus, writing about a century later and preserved for us by Eusebius, gives us the fuller picture of what happened on the day itself. According to Josephus, James was first taken up to a pinnacle of the temple. Ananias's men demanded he publicly deny that Jesus was the Christ in front of the Passover crowds gathered below. James refused. He announced instead, in front of everyone, that Jesus was the Son of Man, seated at the right hand of the Father, and coming again with the clouds of heaven. A great many of the pilgrims began to shout, according to Josephus, Hosanna to the Son of David. Ananias's men could see the crowd turning. They pushed James off the pinnacle. The fall did not kill him. He was, by Josephus's account, still conscious when he hit the ground. And what he did next, in the traditional Christian record, was to kneel on the stones and pray, using words that consciously echoed his brother's words on the cross 33 years earlier. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Then a fuller, a laundryman, stepped forward with a heavy wooden club, and he beat James to death where he knelt. That is the traditional Christian account of how the brother of the Lord died. Josephus does not give us those details. Josephus was writing for a Roman audience and had no theological reason to record the last words of a Christian leader. What Josephus does give us, the Roman-facing political fact, is that Ananias convened an illegal court in a 3-week window with no Roman governor on the ground and used it to kill a man he wanted dead for years. That's how James died. The man the New Testament calls the brother of the Lord, the leader of the Jerusalem church, the author of the Epistle of James, was killed, stoned to death by a Sadducee high priest who exploited a 3-week gap in Roman oversight. And here's what makes it more chilling. Josephus says the most fair-minded citizens of Jerusalem, likely the Pharisees, were so disturbed by what Ananias had done that they secretly sent word to the incoming Roman governor, asking him to put a stop to it. Even the king, Agrippa, was horrified. Ananus was stripped of the high priesthood within 3 months. That's lex talionis with no breaks. That's what happens when the Sadducees get their hands on the law and there's no one in a city strong enough to make them stop. This is the world Josephus is living in as a young priest. He is, at this exact moment, in his early 20s, trying to decide what kind of Jew he wants to be. The Pharisees in his city are the ones secretly writing to Rome to stop a high priest from killing the brother of Jesus. You can now see why Josephus, when he tasted the Sadducees' flavor of Judaism for himself, did not stay long. Before we leave the Sadducees, I want to pull one more thread, because the death of James, the brother of Jesus, which we just walked through, was not an isolated event. It was the third in a series of blows against the early Jerusalem church during Josephus's own lifetime. The first one was Stephen. In about the year 34 AD, before Josephus was even born, the deacon Stephen was stoned to death outside Jerusalem. The Apostle Paul, before his conversion, stood by holding the coats of the men who threw the stones. The account is in Acts chapter 7. It was the first Christian martyr recorded in the scripture. The second was a different James, this one, the son of Zebedee, and the brother of the beloved Apostle John. He was one of the original 12 apostles. Herod Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great, and a different one from the one who killed John the Baptist, had James executed by the sword in about 44 AD. Acts chapter 12, verses 2 tells us plainly, "Now about that time, Herod the king stretched forth his hands to vex certain of the church, and he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword." Peter was arrested at the same time, and he would have been executed with him, but for the angel who released him from the prison in the verses that follow. The third was James, the brother of the Lord, killed by Ananus in 62 AD. Between those three killings, Stephen in the mid-30s, James, son of Zebedee, in the mid-40s, James, the brother of Jesus, in the early 60s, the Jerusalem church was living under an accumulating pressure, persecution, then dispersion, then leadership loss. Peter had already left the city. Paul was on his way to Rome as a prisoner. The apostles were scattered across the known world. And yet, and this is one of the quietly extraordinary details of first century Christianity, the Jerusalem church did not collapse. It reorganized, it gathered under new elders, and it kept writing letters. And in the late 60s AD, as the Roman general Vespasian was closing in on Judea, that same community would receive, according to the historian Eusebius, a prophetic warning to flee. They packed, they left, they walked north, out of Jerusalem. Before the siege closed, we will meet them quietly in episode 3, when the walls of Jerusalem were briefly free of Roman rule, and the Christians of the city, having heard the warnings their Lord had spoken on the Mount of Olives, walked out. They are the only community in the story who read the times correctly, who took Christ's warning seriously, who packed before the tribulation came. That is a pattern worth holding on to for the whole season. So Josephus turned to the Essenes, and if the Sadducees were cruel, the Essenes were eccentric. This devout sect had been active in Judea since the 2nd century BC, known for communal living, strict ritual purity, and apocalyptic beliefs. They're closely associated with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I am aware that there's a conspiracy that the Dead Sea Scrolls are forgery. However, I'm not getting into that conspiracy. You can do your research on your own. On either way you land, the Dead Sea Scrolls are about 900 ancient manuscripts including the earliest known copies of the Hebrew Bible, found in caves near the Dead Sea between 1947 and 1956. Many scholars believe those scrolls were the Essenes library. They practiced strict celibacy. They shared all their possessions. They maintained ritual purity through frequent baptismal baths. Their daily life was a triangle of manual labor, Torah study, and prayer. And their punishments were brutal in a quieter way. The harshest sentence in the community wasn't death, it was banishment. Sounds mild until you understand what it actually meant. An exiled Essene was still bound by his vows. He couldn't eat unclean food. He couldn't break ritual purity. So he wandered the wilderness, eating grass like an animal, and slowly starved to death. Sometimes, when a near dead exile called back to the gates, the community would readmit him. They figured he had suffered enough. Josephus describes it like this, quote, perishes by a most pitiable fate, eating grass, and in hunger, the body wastes away, unquote. After all that, Josephus still wasn't satisfied, so he went looking for someone harder, stranger, quote, nor did I content myself with these trials only, but when I was informed that one whose name was Banus lived in the desert and used no other clothing than grew upon trees, and had no other food than what grew of its own accord, and bathed himself in cold water frequently, both by night and by day, in order to preserve his chastity, I imitated him in those things and continued with him 3 years. Unquote. Banus was a wilderness hermit. If you have any knowledge of the Bible, I'm guessing you already have a picture in your head, and that picture is right. This is the world of John the Baptist. John, of course, was no ordinary hermit. The Lord set him apart from the womb to prepare the way for the Redeemer. Banus had no such calling. He was, as far as we can tell, a man of pure discipline, clothing made of bark and leaves, food taken only from what the earth produced on its own, freezing baths day and night to subdue his body. And Josephus lived this life with him for 3 years. Picture it. The same Judean wilderness where, just a few decades earlier, John had baptized his cousin Jesus in the Jordan. The same hills where the Essenes were copying their scrolls in the dark. The same desert that has, for as long as anyone can remember, been where Israel goes when it needs to find God. 3 years. That's how seriously Josephus took the question of who he was going to be. At 19, Josephus walked back into Jerusalem and made his choice. He committed to the Pharisees. Looking back, he said, quote, when I had achieved my desires, I came back to the city at 19 and started to live according to the rules of the Pharisees, unquote. He saw them as the most practical, the most rational, the Stoics of Judaism. He believed that's why ordinary people followed them. They balanced strict law with everyday reality. So picture this, a privileged young man from a priestly family with an extreme coming of age story, 3 years of starvation in the desert, a philosophical boot camp through every major sect, extreme self-discipline before he entered public life. Privileged, yes, but also relentless and deeply methodical about how he chose to live. By his early 20s, Josephus was a rising young priest. He moved fluently through Jerusalem's elite circles. He built a reputation for learning and piety, and he was a master networker among the priesthood. A word about the emperor Josephus was going to try and influence, because Nero, when Josephus arrived in Rome in 64 AD, was not yet the monster history remembers. He was 26 years old. He had been emperor for 10 years. He had, in his first years on the throne, been governed by his mother Agrippina the Younger, until in the year 59 AD, he had her murdered. He was, at the time Josephus reached Rome, entering the erratic middle phase of his reign, obsessed with the theater and chariot racing, increasingly paranoid, but not yet the persecutor of the Christians the New Testament and the early church remembers. Within a year, Nero would preside over the Great Fire of Rome in July 64 AD, which many people believe he lit himself. The city would burn for 9 days. Nero, according to Tacitus, blamed the Christians for the fire, an accusation that had no historical foundation, but that Nero used as cover for the first imperial persecution of the church. Peter and Paul would both die in that persecution in Rome within 2 or 3 years of the fire. Josephus arrived in Rome. Then, in the last quiet moment before Nero turned on the Christians, he got what he came for. His priest friends were released, and he left Rome before the fire. He would never return to Nero's court. Nero himself would be dead by his own hands within 4 years, and Josephus would meet the family that replaced him, Vespasian and Titus, under circumstances neither man could have predicted. That is the Rome Josephus visited, and that is the emperor whose wife saved his friends. In 63 AD, at the age of 26, Josephus made a pivotal voyage to Rome. Some friends and fellow priests had been arrested by the Roman procurator Felix on minor charges and sent to stand trial before Emperor Nero. Josephus, loyal and well-connected, volunteered to plead for them. Now, for my Christian listeners, the name Felix should ring a bell. Antonius Felix is the same Roman official who held the first trial of the Apostle Paul. After a riot broke out in Jerusalem and the Roman commander Claudius Lysias uncovered a Jewish plot to assassinate Paul, the apostle was sent under heavy military guard down to Caesarea to stand trial before Governor Felix. At that trial, a Jewish lawyer named Tertullus formally accused Paul of inciting riots and desecrating the temple. Paul, a Roman citizen, denied the charges and defended his faith in Jesus. Felix kept stalling, claiming he was waiting for Lysias to arrive, and quietly placed Paul under a lenient form of house arrest. For the next 2 years, Felix and his Jewish wife Drusilla kept summoning Paul to hear him speak about the Christian way. There's a moment in Acts 24 where Paul speaks about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. And Felix becomes frightened. But the text is clear about why he kept the apostle close. He was hoping for a bribe. Some things just never change. So that's the same Felix who arrested Josephus's friends, and Josephus's mission was to plead their case before the emperor. It almost killed him. His ship was wrecked in the Adriatic. Of about 600 people on board, only 80 survived. Josephus spent the night in the water, searching for any speck of dry land. By morning, a ship from Cyrene found the survivors and pulled them aboard. He credited his survival to divine providence. In Rome, he managed to get an audience with Poppaea Sabina, Nero's wife, through a Jewish actor named Eleutherius, a favorite of the emperor's. Poppaea was known for her sympathy towards Judaism. She was even called Theosebes, a God-fearer. Side note, Nero would later kill her. During an argument, he kicked her, and I will add that some scholars suggest she actually died from complications of pregnancy. You can pick whichever theory you prefer. Whatever her motives, Poppaea took Josephus aside, and she secured his friend's release. In 64 AD, Josephus came back to Judea, but he wasn't the same man who left. He'd seen Rome firsthand, the wealth, the architecture, the military discipline, the sheer machinery of empire, and it left a deep mark on him. Some would later say it left too deep a mark, that he came home a little too pragmatic, a little too fond of the Roman ways. What he found at home was a country on the brink. The uneasy peace was crumbling. The great revolt was around the corner. So here's Josephus in 64 AD, a man who had tasted every flavor of Jewish faith, survived a shipwreck, and brushed dangerously close to imperial power. He's seen the grandeur and the menace of Rome with his own eyes. He returns to Judea with gifts, with connections, and with a quiet conviction that bordered on scandal among his own people. Rebellion against Rome would not be brave. It would be a death wish. History, of course, has a way of ignoring the cautious and rewarding the bold or the desperate. Just 2 years after his return, in 66 AD, Judea exploded, and Josephus, the former desert ascetic, the man who tried to talk his people out of war, was named General of Galilee, leading men to battle against the very empire he came to admire. Talk about a plot twist. Years later, after the war was over, Josephus would record the only comprehensive eyewitness account of Jerusalem's fall and the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. To the Romans, his book was useful propaganda. To the Jews, it was an act of betrayal. To us, 2,000 years later, it's an irreplaceable time capsule, the only voice that walked out of the fire. And that's why his story is not ancient history. One more thing before we walk into the modern parallels. A word about the book we are going to be walking through for the next 10 weeks. Josephus wrote the Jewish War in 2 languages. The first version was in Aramaic, his native tongue, written for a Jewish audience in the eastern reaches of the Roman Empire, Babylon, Parthia, the Jewish communities of the Persian frontier. That Aramaic version has not survived. Not a single copy exists. The second version was in Greek, written for a Roman and cosmopolitan audience. Josephus translated his own book. He was assisted, according to his own testimony in his autobiography, by Greek editors provided by the imperial court because his Greek, while functional, was not native. The Greek version has survived. The book runs to 7 volumes in its ancient book divisions. In modern printed editions, it runs to about 600 pages. It has been continuously copied by hand from the 2nd century onward by Roman scribes, then Byzantine monks, then medieval Christian copyists, then the Renaissance humanists, and finally by printers after the invention of the printing press. The English translation you may encounter most often is by William Whiston, an 18th century Cambridge scholar and Anglican clergyman. His translation, first published in 1737, has been in continuous print for nearly 300 years. It is the version I'm reading from throughout the series. Every dramatic reading, every Josephus quote you hear from me across these 10 episodes is from the Whiston translation of the Greek Josephus, faithfully preserved across 2,000 years of hand copying and printing. The Lord has not let this book die. Now, to the parallels. The temple Josephus saw burning has never been rebuilt. One quick historical note about an attempt to build a 3rd temple, because it belongs here and because most Christians have never been told about it. Between 70 AD and today, The Jewish temple site has not stood as an active temple, but there was one attempt to rebuild it, just one, in nearly 2,000 years, and the story of that attempt is worth knowing. His name was Julian. In Christian history, he's remembered as Julian the Apostate. He was the nephew of Constantine the Great, the emperor who, in the early 4th century, had made Christianity the favored religion of the Roman Empire. Julian was raised in an Arian Christian sect, a form of Christianity that denied the full deity of Christ, in much the same way modern Jehovah's Witnesses do. He was baptized, he was educated in the scriptures, and somewhere in his teens or early 20s, in secret, he abandoned Christianity. He became a Neoplatonist pagan. He kept his apostasy hidden for years. When he came to the throne in 361 AD as the sole Roman emperor, he was 30 years old and he had one great project. He wanted to disprove Christianity. Specifically, he wanted to disprove one prophecy, the words Jesus had spoken on the Mount of Olives, that not one stone of the temple would be left upon another. If the temple could be rebuilt, Julian believed the whole Christian claim about Christ fulfilling prophecy would collapse. So in 363 AD, Julian ordered the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. He appointed one of his most trusted men, Alypius of Antioch, to run the project. He committed imperial funds. He invited Jewish workers back to Jerusalem. Materials were gathered. The Jewish community, having waited nearly 300 years, was reportedly overjoyed. Then the project ended. Ammianus Marcellanus, and this is the crucial witness, because Ammianus was a Roman pagan historian, a contemporary to Julian, not a Christian, with no theological reason to invent what he was about to record. He writes plainly in his Roman history that balls of fire broke out near the foundation, repeated bursts, workers were scorched, the site was made inaccessible, the project was abandoned. Whatever the mechanism, and Christian sources through the centuries have not been shy about calling it what they believed it was, the rebuilding was stopped. Within months, Julian was dead, killed by a spear in the middle of a Persian campaign in June 363 AD. At the age of 31, Christian tradition preserves his supposed last words. Nene kakos me, Galilea. You have conquered, Galilean. The rebuilding project died with him, and for the next 1,663 years, until this very year, until the news cycles you have been reading, no serious attempt to rebuild the second temple was made. Christ's prophecy stood, and it still stands until now. Other people, other faiths, other empires have come and gone across that hill. The Jewish temple has not stood there in the lifetime of any human being now alive until quietly and not so quietly that started to change. In Jerusalem, an organization called the Temple Institute has been working since 1987 to prepare for a third temple, not in theory, in practice. They've been crafting the priestly garments woven to the exact specifications laid out in Exodus. They've forged a gold menorah. They've built an altar. They've trained Kohanim, descendants of the priestly line allegedly, in sacrificial rites that haven't been performed in 2 millennia. None of that is hidden. You can visit their museum in the Jewish Quarter. In 2022, 5 pristine heifers were quietly flown from Texas to Israel and prepared for sacrifice. According to the book of Numbers, chapter 19, the ashes of a perfect red heifer without spot or blemish, never having borne a yoke, are required to ritually purify a person before they can enter the temple. No red heifer, no temple. The operation was funded by Jewish and Christian donors together. Of course, they came from Texas. For my Christian listeners, pause on this. The prophecies a lot of you grew up on reading assume a functioning temple. Daniel chapter 9, where the sacrifice and offering are interrupted in the middle of a covenantal 7 years. 2 Thessalonians 2, chapter 2, where the Apostle Paul writes of the man of sin when he's revealed as God sitteth in the temple of God, shewing himself that he is God. Revelation 11, where John is told to take a measuring rod and measure the temple of God, and Jesus' own words on the Mount of Olives, the Olivet Discourse, about the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. The same phrase Daniel used about Antiochus 2 centuries earlier. Jesus tells them plainly, let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains in Matthew 24:16. Every one of those passages assume a temple is standing with sacrifices being offered, with a holy place that can be desecrated. There has not been one for nearly 2,000 years. There is now, for the first time in living memory, a well-organized, well-funded, multi-faith effort to change that. That's not a fringe theory. That's a press release. And the political reality of what it would mean is volatile beyond words. The Temple Mount sits over the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. Any visible move towards temple construction would not just inflame the region, it would almost certainly ignite it. Rockets are already crossing the sky. Israel and Iran have traded direct strikes for the first time in modern history. Tens of millions of evangelical Christians here and around the world are watching the headlines and praying for the next domino to fall because they read it as the doorway to the return of Christ. And in Jerusalem, the garments are sewn, the vessels are forged, the heifers are waiting. I'm not here to tell you what any of this means. That's between you and the Lord and the scriptures you read. But here is what I want you to sit with as we step into Josephus's world together. Of every human being who has ever lived, only one wrote down what it actually looks like when a temple falls. The smoke, the screaming, the blood on the steps of the altar, the mothers in the street, the starvation inside the walls. We just heard a few minutes of it. Whether what is happening today is prophecy fulfilling, catastrophe assembling, or both at once, Josephus is the only voice we have who can tell us from the inside what it costs. That is why we're going to spend these weeks with him. This 10-part series will drop you into the fire alongside Josephus, chapter by gripping chapter, through the Jewish war. If you want sieges, prophecies, betrayals, miracles, horror, and uncanny echoes of our own era, you're in the right place. Welcome to the story. Next week in episode 2, from Pompey to prophets, we go back to 63 BC, the moment a Roman general named Pompey the Great walked into the Holy of Holies and changed what Jerusalem was forever. The 130-year road from that moment to the world Jesus was born into. The procurators who governed it, including a man named Pontius Pilate, and the false prophets and would-be messiahs who set the stage for the war Josephus would walk through. And Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him for to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily, I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Matthew 24, 1-2. Be thou faithful unto death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Revelation 2:10. I'm Nat, and this is the fall of Jerusalem, Josephus and the end of the world. See you inside the walls.